So before I get started, I'll introduce myself. My name is Satish Kumar Viswanathan, and I lead social change and sustainability for a company called ThoughtWorks. We're a consultancy firm. We do custom software development, digital transformation, etc. And we happen to have a huge office right in Coimbatore. It's in ACT Tech Park. We also have offices around the world. I've been a technologist for probably about 20 years. So, take what I say with a little bit of salt. It comes from experience. So yeah, very happy to be here, and thanks to the GDG group, GDG organizers for giving me this opportunity to talk to you all. I'll start with a little anecdote. So I've actually been a little unwell for the last past few days since I was traveling, and this talk was weighing on my mind, and I was sorely tempted, as I'm sure a lot of you may have been in this situation, to use ChatGPT to generate my keynote. Then I tried to look into the faces and minds of you, the audience, who are going to be here today. I told myself, hey, these people are going to be up early on Saturday to come and listen to me. So how can I actually offload the responsibility of this talk to an AI system? So I jumped the idea and then decided to write the talk myself. I'm just kidding, I just use ChatGPT and Bing and Bard and other things as well. So in the end, hopefully you'll be able to make out which parts of this talk are generative AI and which parts of them have been written by me, or maybe not. Right? See, that's really the thing here, So AI tech in general has gotten so good and so incredibly powerful that good to excellent human scale performance on so many tasks, be it like generating this keynote possibly, or generating images in pretty much any style, paintings, digital art, code, screen mock-ups, you name it. The sky is the limit, really, right? Isn't that right? Yeah. Okay, so where do we begin? So I'm sure because you're all spending your day Saturday morning here in this room, that you're here because of a shared love of technology and possibly goodies and free coffee and tea and snacks and all that, right? But let's talk about technology, right? And you note that many of the examples that I'm going to give may not seem immediately relevant, but trust me, I'll hopefully be able to tie it all together at the end, right? So, I'm sure we all can agree that technology, we would not be here in this room without technology, right? And technology is a force for good and can solve all of the world's problems, right? No? Yes? No? Yes? Okay. All right. So technology, the word itself, and I had to do a little bit of research on this, comes from the Greek words techne, which means art or skill or craft. Originally it meant something to do with wicker or basket weaving, basket making. So that's techne. And logia, which means speaking or writing or discourse or theory about any topics. You put them together, you get technology, right? And interestingly, I found that the Sanskrit word takshati, which means to build or construct in the mind, interestingly, also has a very similar root as technology, right? And we also have the word takshak, which means carpenter in Sanskrit, also has the same root. So I think you'll note the emphasis, and I think there are many students here. You note the emphasis on writing, speaking, thinking about the skill and the craft, in addition to actually doing the thing itself, right? And you could argue that this is probably what distinguishes humans as a species from other species, right? It is his ability to communicate ideas. It's his ability to systematize and think and share that knowledge with others that makes us different and is possibly responsible for our current and maybe just fleeting dominance of this planet, right? And you all very well know why I say fleeting dominance, because the way things are going and what we're doing in terms of causing rapid climate change, it's possible that we might just be a tiny footnote during the history of the existence of our planet, unless we change courses fast, right? And one thing that I'm sure all of you are aware, even if subconsciously, is that even though we are in a technology conference, and technology as we know it today might give us visions of Google and generative AI and so on, technology by itself is not new, right? We love speaking about things like revolutionary and game-changing and so on and so forth, right? But technology, if you apply the true sense of the word, I mean, the first possibly truly revolutionary technology was agriculture, right? And that's more than 8,000 years old, and that allowed humans as a species to not have to go from place to place in search of food, but instead center their existence around a physical place, right? Allowed them to grow food and essentially evolve societies and civilizations as we know it today, right? And then you have the wheel, and that was literally revolutionary, right? Pun fully intended. So then you had technology in warfare, in construction, food preservation, in clothing, in communication, in art, and healthcare, all going back thousands of years, right? So even though we are technologists of today's flavor, I think technology has always been around. And the important thing to note is that the impact of these technologies on human civilization and societies has been pretty gradual, right? I mean, many of these technologies really had the full force of their impact maybe thousands of years or centuries or decades later, right? And as we get closer to recent recorded history, what we find is that the impact starts speeding up, right? And more impact in a shorter period of time, and more spread of technology rapidly across different parts of the world. And some of these technologies combined with some others to kind of have what we call multiplicative combinatorial effects on the world itself, right? So that's one point. And just as technology by itself isn't particularly new, the fear of what we call technological disruption isn't particularly new either, right? So if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, which started in England, in 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, you'll find that among the first things to get mechanized was the textile industry, right? And in the 1800s, there were a lot of workers who were protesting against the loss of their jobs because newer machines that were largely powered by steam were essentially automating large parts of their job and essentially leaving them without any livelihood and food. And a group of workers banded together and wrote threatening letters to mill owners and signed it with the name of General Ludd or King Ludd or Ned Ludd, right? And then they also took to nightly raids on factories, threatening workers, mill owners, destroying equipment that was essentially depriving them of their jobs. And a term that I'm sure some of you at least might be familiar with. Have you heard of the term Luddite? Yeah, how many of you heard of the term Luddite? No? So Luddite essentially is a kind of a derogatory term meant to ridicule someone who is afraid of technology, right? Someone who finds it difficult to adopt new technology and doesn't want to adopt it, wants to stick to the same old ways. They're called Luddites, but that's the origin of the term, right? It came from a fear of technological disruption, right? And likewise, there are many other examples, like cars disrupting horse-drawn carriages, the radio disrupting live entertainment for many years, operas, for example, mobile phones disrupting, I don't know, I think too many people in this room are fairly too young to remember. How many of you know what an STD PCO booth is? We have very few hands, few hands, okay, some of you know, right? But back in the days when I was in a college like yours, the only way to make phone calls back home, was to go out to one of these STD PCO booths, and then you could dial your home number if you happen to have a phone at home, and they would connect you, and that was it, right? There was no mobile phones and so on. Now I'm pretty sure all of you have mobile phones, right? And with the emergence of mobile phones and increasing availability of technology, the entire business model completely disappeared, right? So, and the important thing to note is that even though these type of disruptions seem fairly different, the issues underlying the fear of these technological disruptions are actually fairly similar, right? I mean, one was like lost jobs, lost livelihoods. I think that was one. Other was around moral panic, right? Oh, what will happen to society? Society will get corrupted, and our youth will get spoiled, right? And all of these, in fact, some of these things were actually said about something as innocent as what you would call the bicycle, right? So when the bicycle was first introduced in England in the I forget exactly which year, it gave women a lot of freedom of movement, and that really threatened people in power, right? And particularly men, saying, oh, what will happen to our women if they have the freedom to move around without being escorted by horse-drawn carriages and so on and so forth. And that led to a huge backlash in the use of bicycles in England, right? So, so you get the point, right? I mean, so one, technology is not particularly new, and two, fear of technological disruption is not particularly new either, right? And those themes have been around ever since we've had technology, right? So now that I've given you a little bit of pop history lesson on the history of technology in about 5 minutes or so, before I go further, I want to do a quick poll of the audience. So if I can request Pika to put up the first poll. So the first question is, if I could request the audience to scan this and with me. The first question is, technology is inherently neutral. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? We need the QR code again. Okay, let's see what the results are. So many of you think technology is inherently neutral. Good number of you disagree. That's very, very interesting. Okay, so this is actually a common understanding of technology in general, right? I mean that technology is neither good nor bad, right? It depends on who uses it, right? I'm sure you've heard these arguments, right? Have you heard of this phrase, guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? Have you heard of this phrase? It's very popularized by this organization called the National Rifle Association in the United States. I'm sure even if you've had like a passing reference to seeing news coming out of the United States, like every week, every other week, there's some guy who feels like they have to take it out on the world. They have a gun, they go to either a classroom or some other public space, shoot up a bunch of people and shoot themselves, right? I mean, this is like a very common theme, and this gun violence has been significantly exacerbated by this argument that gun is a neutral technology, right? It can be used for good or bad. but what do we do if the people choose to use for killing other innocent people, right? That's one type of argument. Another argument that you might have heard is about nuclear fission, right? I mean, you argue that nuclear fission can be used both for powering nuclear plants as well as for creating the atom bomb, right? But the technology itself is neutral. But is that really the case? I mean, that's one thing that I want to ask you all, right? That what I think ultimately the kind of technology that we build reflects the values of the builders and the societies that build it, right? And there's this writer called Andrew Greenberg who wrote a book called The Critical Theory of Technology, and then he says that the kind of technology we build reflects the values of builders and the societies that build them, right? But it's also important to note that this is not an argument for saying, hey, we shouldn't have invented guns or discovered nuclear fission in the first place, right? It's not a binary between saying, okay, we either build technology or we don't, right? I think the idea is to think that we need to think more deeply about the type of paths that technology takes, or the type of technologies that we choose to build, right? But you also need to think about how much of the technology depends on the values of people that build it or actually pay for it. Now, let me take an example of something that at least some of you in the room might have a little bit more experience with, right? So, how many developers, professional developers of all shapes and stripes in the room? Quick show of hands. Okay, fair number. All right. So, among those, how many of you are aware of what are called accessibility guidelines? WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Okay, some of you in the room, right? And how many of you actually, if you're building products or apps, how many of you actually built that into your products or services or applications? Keep your hands up if you've already done that. Okay, that's a surprisingly decent number, right? But still a small fraction of people that actually work on the web. Okay, let me take another counter example, right? So how many of you folks have seen what I call the cookie monster? So whenever you go to a website, there's this thing that appears at the bottom and say, hey, our website uses cookies, click here to accept or reject or select all of that. How many of you have seen that? Yeah, anyone who's been on the web has seen that, right? And again, if you're building an app or website or service, particularly for a market that is not India, how many of you actually implemented these GDPR, cookie preference features? Can you put your hand up? Yeah, some of you, right? So I would argue that in the first case, it happens to be kind of optional, right? I mean, you don't have to necessarily make something accessible, it will probably get by. In the second case, if you are building something for the European market or for the American market, if you can't build or if you don't have a GDPR compliance notice, you probably can't launch your product, right? Now, in the first case, even if non-functional, cross-functional requirements happen to be discussed, and some product manager sitting in a room somewhere says, maybe people with visual disabilities aren't necessarily in our MVP market right now, so let's kind of deprioritize that. We'll get to it later, and then things roll around, and eventually that part never gets done, right? And it's a very, very common scenario, just like the hack that we say, okay, we'll just put it in and we'll take it out on the next release and we have more time to work on it. It never gets done, right? In the second case, if you need to launch the product, there's probably some sales guy, or if you are working for a large enough company, there's probably your lawyer that says, hey, we can't launch your product till you are compliant with GDPR, right? And then whether budget is there or not, that feature gets done like that in double click, because it's a roadblock to actually launching the product itself, right? So what's the moral of this story here, right? I mean, both of these features arguably are really good ones, right? I mean, some help people with visual disabilities access products or services that they would not otherwise be able to use on one hand. The other is, it requires in some parts it's driven by compliance, but arguably it's a good thing because it protects people's right to privacy and so on and so forth, right? But in today's world, you will find that most people end up implementing GDPR cookie preferences over accessibility or making the products fully accessible to people with visual disability, right? And we are here today, and it's not because the people making those choices are necessarily evil or they don't care, right? I think from their part they just make very, very logical choices, but we still end up in a place where a significant number of people may not be able to use the services that non-disabled people just take for granted, right? I mean, be it taken Ola or Uber, or even to use the web in a very quote unquote normal way. So I'd like you to ponder the situation for a little bit, right? Now, let's circle back to generative AI and when I first started this talk, right? And since ChatGPT was released in November 2022, it's taken the world by storm. I think it was the fastest product to, I forget if it was like 10 million users or 100 million users. In record quick time, in a matter of months, literally, right? And it was capable of doing things that were previously thought impossible or very poorly done by AI. And that's a broader trend that we see in tech, where these trends are increasingly sweeping through our interconnected world really, really fast and at scale, right? I mean, it happened with the internet, it happened with social media, it happened with mobile phones, it happened with cloud adoption, and now it's happening with the latest generation of AI, right? And the time frame for these, what I call mass diffusions of tech, has been rapidly shrinking. I mean, it was centuries earlier, then became decades, as in the case of, say, television, for it to become, ubiquitous, be available in every home, to maybe years, and now, as in the case of, say, maybe social media, and now to maybe even years, right? In just a few years, we are seeing almost everybody using generative AI technologies, right? And I would liken the situation to what the writer Rachel Carson, and Rachel Carson is an environmentalist. She wrote a very famous book called Silent Spring. I don't know how many of you have heard of it. Written in the 1970s, and Silent Spring essentially talks about the effects of increasing usage of chemicals like insecticides and pesticides, fertilizers, and chemicals of all sorts in industries, etc., polluting the environment, polluting water bodies, and essentially having knock-on effects on the food that people eat, people's health, and so on and so forth, right? And the point that she made was that there have been so many new kinds of synthetic chemicals that have been introduced since we started manufacturing it, since oil and gas became cheap, that the human body, which was used to adapting to new elements or new things in its environment over a period of hundreds of thousands of years, was suddenly being forced to adapt to this really onslaught of chemicals. Onslaught of chemicals in a matter of a few decades or a few years, and it wasn't able to do that, and people felt sick, with lots of effects on health, leading to the formation of the US Environmental Protection Agency, right? And that's really I'd like to draw a parallel analogy here to say that the effects that these chemicals had on the human body, I think they are having similar kind of effects on human, or the increasing trends or increasing acceleration of technology is having on human societies, right? Not just humans, right? And we're being exposed to so many new ideas, so much of new information, new tech, that societies or the adaptation mechanisms that human societies have had or been able to evolve for previous generations of technology are increasingly becoming inadequate, right? So that's something that I'd like you to ponder, right? I mean, don't mistake me for for being a Luddite or someone who doesn't like technology, right? I wouldn't be in this room if I were. And these changes have brought in some really amazing changes to the way we do very simple things like, interact with people, how we form communities, how we create, consume content, and pretty much anything else that you can think of. But there is also a dark side to many of these, right? What I call unintended consequences of the technology, right? Say take increasing usage of social media. I'm sure pretty much everybody in this room is on social media, right? But some of the dark sides or unintended consequences of it are, addiction, increasing polarization, right? I mean, people of one maybe political viewpoint or viewpoint about a topic, cannot see eye to eye with somebody else who has an opposite viewpoint, right? They are, if you look at Twitter or any other social media you're part of, you'll find that it's increasingly polarized. People stick to their own viewpoints, not very unwilling to listen to others, right? People are essentially in their own information bubbles, right? And the way these algorithms are designed to maximize certain metrics like engagement ensures that the most sensational content is rapidly surfaced to the top. That's what you keep on seeing. It learns your preferences really quickly, and and what you could be seeing could be very, very different from what your neighbor or somebody who is has slightly different ways of thinking, different interests are seeing. So each of us are increasingly in our own information bubbles, right? And we don't really get other different perspectives. The rapid spread of fake news is probably another one that I'm sure all of us are aware of as some of the unintended consequences of rapid rise of social media. If you talk about the ubiquity of mobile phones, the reduced social cohesion, how many memes have we seen about people or friends going to a restaurant, each of us is on our own mobile phones, not really paying attention to each other. Reduced attention spans, addictions, withdrawals, all of these are some of the unintended or side effects or dark sides of the technology that we take for granted today. And lots of people have thought about, written about, very thoughtfully about these things, and companies have also reacted to things that they are seeing, right? So for example, Google and Apple, as part of their devices, they have well-being measures. So if you use an Android phone or an iOS phone, you have the capability to see how much time you're actually spending on screen, and they offer you suggestions and ways to cut down on that, right? But essentially, you see these as reactions to potential consequences that they could not have foreseen, right? On the social media side, WhatsApp has the ability to restrict people from forwarding messages to more than 5 people, I think, at a time, to essentially try and slow the spread of fake news. And regulations have also been brought in, for example, right? When I already spoke about the European Union's GDPR legislation, which is a landmark legislation. Many other countries are considering something similar. And I think more recently, with the rise of generative AI, a lot of countries, India included, are thinking about regulating AI systems and particular large language models, right? So it would seem like this could be a good way to go. So I'd like to get a sense of what the audience thinks about this, right? So can we get the next question up, please? So what do you think, now that we've seen some of the unintended consequences of some of the technology that we built and become rapid, what do you think is going to be most effective in preventing these unintended harms of technology? Okay. Consumer activism. Okay. Like some of you trust the government, many of you don't. it's interesting that more technology is probably quite low. I would have expected in a room of technologists to see that number be much, much higher. Great, thank you for sharing your thoughts. See, the point here is that whatever you answered, it's possibly already partially correct in some ways, right? I mean, there's no silver bullet, there's no one single answer. I think it will require some or all of these to help us guard against building or against the unintended harms of technology that we build, right? But the thing to keep in mind if you're a technologist is that many of these aren't really under your control, right? I mean, government regulation takes its own sweet pace. Consumer activism, if you're a consumer, yes, I mean, you're an individual consumer, it requires consumers to band together, create organized movements that, pressurize companies into doing something or rectifying the harms of technology they build. You build more technology, right? You might solve one problem, but you might create another, right? Now, what is in your control is, the technology that you're building. If you're a technologist, you're working on a product or a service, you have control over what you're building, right? And as I said before, that is reflective of the values that you hold, right? And it's here in this very last part that I have a little bit of advice in terms of what you can do that is directly under our control, right? First thing that I would say is go back to the basics. Ask the fundamental questions. Is what we're building ethical? Should we even build this feature, right? And here I would draw attention to various things that have been described as dark patterns. How many of you have heard of the term dark patterns? This is particularly used in user experience design. So it's like, for example, you are trying to book a flight on a travel website and they say, hey, hurry up and book soon, only 2 flights left, right? So what do? Even if you are not really sure, because you see that scarcity essentially pressuring you into buy something that you may have possibly waited a little bit more on, or only 5 items left in stock, order soon, right? It's an example of a dark pattern. Another one would be like, okay, making it really hard for you to delete your account on a website if you signed up, because the company or the user or service is making money off of you, right? So if you are thinking about building something like this, please think about if it would be ethical if you were at the other side. Would you want something like this built, and would you want to be subjected to that, right? That's the first part. And I think the second one is many of the times we end up building features that may have consequences that we may not have thought about, right? So it requires a little bit more conscious deliberation, conscious thinking to think about the possible unintended consequences of what might happen. There are many frameworks out there that will help you think. There's a framework called ethicalOS.org. It's not an operating system, but it's a series of thinking exercises that help you think about if I do this, what could possibly go wrong along various different dimensions, be things like security or privacy, inclusion, exclusion of people, and so on and so forth, right? So I'd encourage you all to think about that. Then the other thing that we may not pay attention to as much is diversity, right? And there have been a lot of technological snafus or things that have gone wrong with technology, and it's possible that many of those could have been mitigated if the people making the decisions, right, either during design or during saying that, okay, let's go ahead and build this, or actually implementing something, if that group had been a little bit more diverse, right? And I don't mean diversity just in terms of men-women balance, but diversity in many different dimensions, right? People in different areas, people who have different types of experiences, and so on. And usually that surfaces different perspectives that helps you make better decisions, right? And if everybody in the room is thinking similarly, there's very likely that there are things that you missed or unintended consequences that you missed, right? And lastly, and I think this is relevant to a large set of audience in this room who are students, is read very widely, right? I mean, we are in an engineering college. I'm an engineer myself. And one thing that as engineers we probably have very, very less exposure to, and probably hated during our school, I know I did, are things like history, right? Philosophy, and maybe economic thought, right? And our engineering curriculum really does us a disservice by giving us very, very poor exposure to these areas of study and humanities in general, right? And while it is fantastic for us to be able to translate and be excellent problem solvers, take any problem, write code to solve it, solve a real world problem, it is our lack of exposure, and it says lack of systematic exposure to the humanities, to history, to what has gone wrong, that possibly leaves us blindsided to some of these unintended consequences of the technology that we're building. So please, I encourage you to read widely, read history, read about the history of technology, very, very fascinating stories that I'm sure we all can learn from, right? So in other words, what I'm exhorting you all to do is, practice what I would call broadly responsible technology, right? And so the best way to think about responsible technology is, if at the one end of the spectrum, if you're able to think about it as a spectrum of, what is responsible technology versus what is not, at one end is like, okay, negligence, right? So you don't even do the bare minimum to either, protect your user security or, privacy, you leak their data and so on, right? I mean, don't do that, right? And the other end is like, thinking about the positive consequences, things that you can do to enhance user experience, and not just user experience, right? I mean, there are stakeholders who may not necessarily be users. Think about people who are using your product, who are the people who don't get to use your product, right? If particular technology allows maybe somebody to get ahead on, say, your IRCTC train booking, that is at the expense of some guy who's standing in a physical railway counter somewhere else, then is that technology something that you want to build, right? So you need to consider the entire spectrum. The bare minimum that you would want to do is, things like, security, privacy, and compliance, because at the bare minimum you need to do to keep out of trouble, right? Or to use a colloquial phrase, to cover your ass, right? But I think as technologists, we need to go a lot more beyond that, right? We need to think actively about potential unintended consequences of the technology that we build, and if possible, make the world a little better place through the use of our technology, right? And this is where things like building sustainable software, building green software, software that reduces the use of energy consumption, reduces the use of cloud, and essentially runs greener, all of that come about, right? And as creators of technology, we have great power, right? And I'm sure you know what comes next, right? With great power comes what? Great responsibility. All right. So with that, I end my talk. So please be responsible technologists. But before I go, I would like to put up another final poll question for you all, which is what I began my talk with. So how much of this talk was generated by ChatGPT /Bard / Bing? Many of you are hedging, somewhere in between. All right, fantastic. Thank you so much. And as with all good things, some things need to remain a mystery. So this is one thing that only I and my Google Docs version history will know. Thank you very much.